Welcome back. We now have Meichelle Arntz with Angels Foster Care joining us, another participant in the Stanford Leadership Conference. Meichelle, often nonprofits only consider about doing good, but I think we need to go beyond that and think about doing well. And part of that is understanding what your clients' real needs are. And I understand that that was part of the core learnings that you took away from Stanford. How would you talk about that issue?
You know, the whole conference was amazing, but I must say that I did have a really good experience with one of the speakers. Her name was Jocelyn Wyatt, and she spoke to us about design thinking for social innovation. And that's kind of fancy for just saying, you know, we've always looked at business for-profit models as designing. You know, they come up with like the laptop computer, right. They come up with the iPod, with the ultrasonic toothbrush, all those kind of things. But we haven't really looked at using a design model as much when we look at NGOs or nonprofit agencies that are serving social needs, social problems. And so the main point of her particular presentation was, how can we use design models to help us better meet the needs of the people that we're serving in the community to do good, as you mentioned. And she gave us some examples, which I thought, for me, I remember things better if I hear it sometimes in a story. Mm-hmm. And so she gave us a few examples of things that she has seen and ways that her company has identified needs through using a design model. So I would love to tell you about a couple of those.
I'd love to hear about them. Let me just make sure I understand, in a sense, the paradigm that you're speaking about. In a sense, you're saying that nonprofits have a market and have consumers just the way business does. And
exactly.
That we do better as nonprofits when we look at things that way and try to meet those consumer needs.
Exactly.
Okay, with that said, give us some good examples of that.
One of the things she talked about was a model where there was a village that is in India, and it's in the countryside, and the people for generations have used a borehole for their water supply. And the problem was that the people that were using the borehole were getting sick often. It was sometimes contaminated, things like that. And it's a problem that we see in a lot of countries where they're still developing. And so an NGO, a non-government organization, went in and put in a water treatment system and a little plant there near the village, and in hopes that by giving the people some pure drinking water for use for cooking and drinking and all these types of things, that they could control some of the contamination and disease that was happening through the borehole water. So they had the challenge of getting that system set up, which went in nicely and was functioning well. But many of the villagers were not using the treatment system. They were still going to the borehole. So the design team went in and looked to see kind of what was going on and see if they could figure it out. And what was happening was they looked at a particular family. They called her Shanti in this particular lecture. And she and her husband lived together in a home. There was just the two of them. And she was using the borehole. And the reason she was using the borehole was not for the reasons that you might think. The water treatment plant was close to her home, so it wasn't an issue of her walking there or walking back. There was a charge for the water, but it was 20 cents a day, which was affordable. Shanti could afford this, and the villagers could afford this. Many villagers looked upon it as a bit of a status symbol if they could pay for their water even, so that was kind of a positive thing. But what they found when they started talking with her was that she was by herself during the day. Her husband worked in the city. And the 3-gallon jug that she normally used at the borehole that was shaped with a rounded bottom and a fluted top, she could easily carry it on her head or on her hip at the water treatment plant, they were required to use a 5-gallon jug that was square, and she couldn't lift it. It was too heavy for her, and by the time her husband got home, the water treatment plant was closed. The other problem was they were required to buy a month punch card, and then they would get it punched every day when they went to pick up their water. And so she was getting a 5-gallon jug. She had to buy an entire month's worth of water, and her family only used 2 to 3 gallons a day. So she was wasting a lot of money too by being required to do it this way. So there were some things in place that were prohibitive for her to use the treatment plant. So she continued to use the borehole, and they found this situation was common.
That is a great example, because think of the conclusions, the wrong conclusions one might draw for her not using the new system. And here it were practical reasons, some cultural reasons, and if the nonprofit understands things, in a sense, on the ground like that, we can do a better job.
Exactly.
Can you give me one example that might be relevant to Santa Barbara?
Well, you know, let me just think for a minute, because she gave a few examples and hers were so good, and I do think that the idea is relevant to Santa Barbara, because we can take these lessons and learn them no matter what the story is. The other story that I thought was really important to hear today, because she told about 5, but the second one that really hit me was there were some designers that went into Vietnam to look at malnutrition, because about 65% of the children under the age of 5 in Vietnam are malnourished. And we can apply that in the United States too, or anywhere we're working, but at different levels and in different geographical areas. But the problem in this instance was the government was giving out nutritional supplements to the families. They weren't getting the desired results. They still had about 65% malnourished kids under the age of 5. So the design team came in, they went into a village in Vietnam, and they looked at what's called a positive deviation. So when we hear the word deviation, we also think of it, or deviant, we think of it in a negative terminology, but they were looking at positive deviations. And in this case, what that was, they asked the villagers to bring them 6 families that were very, very poor, that were living in very severe circumstances, but their children were healthy and nourished. And so they brought in they found 6 families that, in spite of these harsh situations, their children were healthy and nourished. And they followed them around and watched them, and they watched what they did. Particularly, they looked at the way they gathered food, the way they prepared food, and the way they served food. And what they found out was the parents that had the healthy kids were gathering little crabs and shrimps and snails from the rice paddies. And they were also using the greens of the sweet potatoes, which is a staple there, sweet potatoes. But most of the families were throwing away the greens and only eating the sweet potato. But the families that had healthy kids were adding in the greens. So
in a sense, using people from the client base who were doing things correctly to be the leaders, peer leaders, you might say.
Exactly. And the people that were the positive deviants that were doing things differently didn't realize that they were the leaders. They didn't know they were doing something different, but they became the community leaders as the design team designed a system where they could teach their neighbors what they were doing. And the crabs and stuff were in the rice paddies. It was free. It was a food source that was accessible to the communities. And they were able to get an 80%, after 1 year, an 80% good nutrition rate with the kids. They were working with 1,000 kids. 80% of them were adequately nourished.
That is really fascinating, Meichelle. Perhaps you could tell us how you might apply that to your organization.
I'm glad you asked that. I think in design thinking, there's 3 steps that's important for me to use in my organization. One of them is inspiration. And inspiration is the problem or opportunity that inspires us to do something about it, which I can use here locally. Then there's ideation, which is where you take the ideas, you generate them, you develop them, and you test them. And then the next phase is to implement them. And that's where you take it from your design model to the people and apply it in their lives. And this is a model that I'm going to be using in my organization to try and improve and do better to make sure we're meeting the needs of our clients.
That's great. The 3 I's.
The 3 I's.
Inspiration, ideation, implementation. Terrific.
That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
When we come back, we'll have David Landecker of the Environmental Defense Center, and he will tell us about his experience at Stanford University.